No, I'm still not going to list every action chunk for you. Not even now that we're moving on to actually writing stories. The action chunks will come on their own as you write them. You've already got location chunks, so you know what kind of places you're writing about. You got your event chunks, so you know what's going on. Action chunks, you can plan them ahead, or you can write them on the fly. They're usually equally good. It's details, it's small events, it's human behavior. Unless you're dealing with very elaborate human behavior or very elaborate storytelling, the Shakespearean path of writing, you will not need to plan out every little detail. You will need to have a general idea of where you're going, and then you write what happens. The action chunks are just things done. Writing the action chunks at this point is simply writing a summary of the story you're trying to tell. Writing is very often a misunderstood craft. There are definitely creative elements in every part of it, but more so than many other artistically leaning crafts, writing is about technique. Writing is about knowledge. I'm not going into what's excellent writing. I'm not going to tell you how to write a masterpiece. That takes a level of creativity that is almost impossible to teach. What I can tell you is how to achieve adequate writing and what you can do with that once you have it. Let's take something that is deceivably simple in its description, but allows for quite a lot of complexity. The chunk during the run from the student housing to campus, when all of the older students start being mean to the new ones. The chunk that is about ditches might seem very simple. They run, they fall into a ditch. They need to run through the ditch and get out. But that's not the whole point, is it? When writing a story, the point is not to tell what's going on, but to convey the experience of what's going on, to convey the experiences that the main characters are exposed to. On a surface level, that means describing sights, sounds, all of the sensory input that comes from being in the situation, the impact of landing in the ditch, the shift in gravity as you drop, as you fall, because you were surprised, the smell of the dug earth, the brown that's around you, the way that sounds start to echo differently, the touch of moist dirt beneath your fingers as you support yourself against the ground or the walls of the ditch. There are some tricks to writing. One of those tricks is to simply list things that one might notice in a situation. It could be any situation. Sit in a car, you notice the feel of the seats. You notice the smell of the interior. You notice the sounds, you notice the little lights. Stand in an old, dilapidated house. You notice all the flaky paint. You notice the moist smell in the air. You notice the uneven footing of the floorboards. This is not artistic. This is a craft. Simply list things that one might notice in a situation and describe them calmly, one by one, using as varied a language as you can. The floorboards creaked. They felt uneven. The paint on the walls was broken, cracks running through them like spider webs. This is not artistic. This is craft. You describe things one might notice, and you have one comparison, like spider webs. This is something anyone can do, and that is important to understand. Because if you lose yourself in some strive for pretentious artistic expression, you miss the entire point of writing a story. You are conveying an experience, and that experience starts with sensory input. What comes after sensory input then? Emotional responses. What do these sensory inputs remind the character of? The creaky floorboards may remind them of a horror movie. The flaking paint on the wall could remind them of their grandparents' home or an old shed in the garden. Like comparisons, these can be plucked from thin air. They need not tie closely into other things in the story. They are an opportunity to reflect on things that describe the character observing, but that is about it. It need not be any more than that. A character that comes from the countryside might compare things to what you would see in a barn or a field or a forest. A character that comes from the city might compare things to what you could see in old buildings, in various districts, in markets. What they compare their experiences to will be a great way to describe the character in more depth. But it is not an artistic endeavor. It is merely a question of listing things that might fit the character and might seem like the sensory input they are getting. Once you get more capable of creating descriptions like this, it becomes easier to mix them with what is going on. The character walked across the creaking floorboards, looking at the cracked paint on the walls, and grabbed a chair to sit down in. Then you repeat. More sensory input, more comparisons. The chair was old and wobbly. Thin wooden pieces put together as best as possible reminded him of his granddad's old chair back at the cottage, and so on and so on and so on. Your style will very often depend on what you pick to fixate on, how relevant it is to the story at hand, how narrow you focus. Do you focus entirely on the chair, or do you focus on things around it, on the dust on the floor, on the table, on things put near it like a vase or an old box, or do you just focus on what the chair looks like? The kinds of observation you make and the amount of observations you make and the length of your descriptions of each observation will very much define your style of writing. Structuring beyond that can actually help flesh out things even more, make them more immersive. You already have a location with all its descriptions. Making what you're describing as part of the action fit in more with that description, making it seem more like a part of it, is one way to elaborate on the situation. The whole location is a rundown township. You're elaborating on that when you describe how a certain building, a certain house, even a certain chair inside is run down. And you can compare it to the outside world around it. All the dilapidated buildings falling apart. Or You can contrast it. You can have a chair that looks strangely pristine, that looks like it's not falling apart, that looks strong, inside a house that looks decrepit and broken. Contrast stands out, but so does similarity. You choose. And adding to that, there are the events going on. That is easier to compare to actions more than things. Are they running in the ditch? The ditch is a surprise, so maybe they are shocked too much to start running. Maybe they are stunned. Maybe they are confused. Maybe the character notices others being like that, giving a chance to describe it. He notices a young man who seems to have fallen strangely on his foot, limping a bit, trying to get up and running, but not knowing where to run to. His clothes slightly dirty, slightly thrown about around him, not fitting him right anymore. When describing a character's actions, comparing them to events around them, effectively comparing the event chunk to an action chunk, can open up a lot of possibilities for creative writing, but it is still not an artistic endeavor. You do not need some kind of special inspiration. You simply need to describe smaller elements of the situation. You can make them as a list, simply brainstorming them, and pick whichever you feel like using. Once you've picked them, it's merely a matter of having a vocabulary so you don't repeat the same words, the same phrases, the same structures of sentences all too often. The old he said, she said dilemma. Do you simply follow every line of dialogue with he said? Or do you elaborate on it? He whispered, he mumbled, he grumbled, he added. This is a debate that goes on in a lot of writing circles. You choose your style. In the end, the combination of chunking and breaking up the story to structure it and then simply writing in the way described is enough to get a fully functional, more than adequate piece of writing off your hands. Very often, the structure without the creative writing will be a fraction of what the end product will be. Most writing is additive. You have something already, you have a finished story, but then you just add to it. You add flavor, you add details. Sometimes you simply add words to make it not as dense as it is when it's just a summary. There is nothing wrong with that. That is how you get from a very short, abrupt list of things happening to writing a full story. How much you want to add and what kind of details you want to add, it's all up to you. And if you consistently add the same amount and the same kind of details, congratulations, you've just developed your own writing style.